Welcome back, folks, to part 3 of our ecology unit. This time we're going to cover 8.3 and 8.4 in the AP Bio topics, and that will be population ecology and the effects of density on populations. So, we're talking populations, right? And there's a hierarchy of living systems um, and different structures that interact. Some examples of that would be things like body systems are made up of organs are made up of tissues are made up of cells are made up of organelles, etc. Social structures like alpha and beta wolves, predator-prey relationships, different trophic levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we're down to things like an individual, a family, a population, okay, or a community or an ecosystem. Okay. Today, let's look at populations, okay, and population ecology. Population ecology explores how biotic and abiotic factors influence the density of a population, its distribution across an area, the size of the population, and the age structure. Are they more young, more old, more in the middle, and those kind of things. Just a fun little video on turtles here you can watch. You don't have to, you can skip it if you want to, but I'll catch you on the other side of that.
Swimmers also come to Ascension to breed. A female green turtle approaches the coast. She's not eaten once in 2 months. She may have travelled 1,000 miles from her feeding grounds, the greatest journey of her kind. Many others are here too, resting on the sandy sea floor, awaiting the darkness of night, when it'll be safer to visit the beaches. Eggs that were laid a few weeks ago at the start of the season are beginning to hatch. Most hatchings happen at night. Now, in the light of day, the young are extremely vulnerable. They must get to the sea as soon as possible. But their trials have only just begun. Many will drown in the pounding waves. During the next 20 years, the vast majority will inevitably die. But those that survive will eventually, as their mothers did before them, return to the very same beach where they were hatched. How they find their way back across thousands of miles of open ocean, we still have no idea.
So you can see there's a lot of factors that influence how many of those turtles survive to adulthood to reproduce, right? And so there's a lot of factors that can influence their populations. Whether they hatch at all, if they're buried in the sand the right distance, predators digging out of the nest, predators getting them when they get out of the nest, getting smashed up against rocks and stuff in the surf, drowning in the surf, predation in the sea, all sorts of things mess with their ability to survive. So the chances of any one making it to adulthood and reproducing are, relatively speaking, kind of small. And those are the kind of things we have to study in population ecology. Right. So biological processes influence population density, dispersion, and demographics. So Just a refresher, a population is a group of individuals of a single species living in the same general area. And we define the area ourselves. We can say population of a pond, the population of a field, the population of a county. Okay. So populations comprise individual organisms that interact with one another and with the environment in complex ways. And we describe that population by the boundaries and size that we decide. Okay. Density of population is the number of individuals per unit area or volume. So are they packed in really tight together, like in a major city with humans, or are they spread way out, like in the country? And dispersion is the pattern of spacing. Are there like a bunch of them here and a bunch of them there, and then not much in between? Are they pretty evenly distributed? That kind of thing. In most cases, it's impractical or impossible to count all the individuals in a population because population is just too big and we can't accurately count everybody. So we tend to use sampling techniques. You don't need to know them, but a common one would be if we wanted to figure out how many dandelions were in the football fields out here, right? We could go out and we could throw down some random 1 meter square boxes and then count every dandelion in that 1 meter square. And as long as the dispersion of the dandelions in that field were looked to be relatively uniform, we could extrapolate and say, okay, if there's 5 dandelions per square meters and we have 100 square meters, then we probably have 500 dandelions in this field. Density is the result of an interplay between processes that add and subtract individuals from a population. Now, obviously, births add and deaths ultimately detract or remove individuals from a population. But we can also influence that by immigration, having new individuals move in from other areas, or emigration, having individuals move out of an area. So you can see here, births add, immigration adds, but if you get killed, population goes down, or if you move away, the population in that area moves down. Now, we did talk about patterns of dispersion a little bit a minute ago. Environmental and social factors can influence the spacing of individuals in a population. In a clump dispersion, like we see up here, I like these pictures right here, right? We can see they kind of clump in little groups here and there, and there's not much in between. Clump dispersion may be influences by resource availability and behavior. So they may clump together because, well, you tell me why. Why might they clump together? Could be anything. Could be that these are the areas where they have the right resources and there's nothing in between, right? It could be that they clump together for mating purposes. It could be they're clumping together for protection, like herds and things like that, right? And flocks of birds in the sky to ward off predators. So lots of things like that. You could have a uniform dispersal right here where they're equally spaced out, or we could have just random dispersal here. So do we have a slide on that? All right, so uniform dispersion is one in which the individuals are evenly distributed across an area. A little more rare that it's evenly distributed, but it's often influenced by social interactions like territoriality, the defense of a bounded space against other individuals, things wolves marking their territory, that kind of thing. Can you think of any benefits to being territorial? Yeah, so we're talking intra-specific competition here, right? Competition between individuals of the same species. And they might be competing to make sure that they lock up all the mates in that area, or competing to make sure that they lock up the resources. There's enough for them and their group, right? So they don't want to share that with others because that reduces their chances of survival. And then we didn't talk about, random dispersion. That's most likely caused because there's not really much difference in the resource availability all across this field. And it's just kind of random, and there's no benefit or harm for them being close together or far apart. It's just where the seeds happen to fall. You get random. All right, let's move on to the next section. All right, guys, welcome back. Let's take a look at the stuff covered in your book in chapter 53.2. Specifically, this is dealing with the math of population growth, the rate of growth. So we're taking into account how much death there is in the population, how many births there are in a population, and how that affects population growth over time. So we're going to start by looking at exponential growth, which is growth in an idealized, unlimited environment. Now, we did learn this in Bio 1. The same basic concepts apply. If you have no limiting factors, you got plenty of resources, plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of space, limited competition, no competition, you're hunky dory land, the population can grow exponentially. So instead of growing a nice even curve, it'll grow and just shoot through the roof. That's what the human population appears to be in right now. So it's useful to study population growth in an idealized situation like that. It doesn't happen often, but it allows us to compare what would happen in an ideal situation and what happens most of the time with most populations. Okay. Humans are an example of it happening. We also see it sometimes in unique situations in nature, particularly things like invasive species, where you get a new species into an area that's never had it before, and there's no disease, there's no predation. We get rid of a lot of those limiting factors that can reduce their population growth. So, per capita rate of increase. So here's the things that can affect population size, right? So change in population size is equal to the number of births plus immigrants, right? So that's the additions. And then we subtract from the population by deaths and immigrants leaving. Okay. If we ignore emigration, which can be useful to do, I mean, at least to start off, to understand the conditions in a local environment and how that's affecting population growth, we can get the per capita increase or growth rate of the individuals, which is birth rate minus death rate. So we can express that mathematically, is change in n over change in t, or dn over dt. Same thing here, guys. And that's the number of births minus the number of deaths. So change in n is change in population size. So, negative 15 in 1 year. That would be the in time interval. Change in rate over change in time is the growth rate, which we'd say R. So if you're basically doubling your population every year, your growth rate would be 1. Okay, you'd have, increase of 1 every year. Okay, B is the number of births and D is the number of deaths. So birth rate and death rate, B and D, can be expressed as the average number of births and deaths per individual. So B is the annual per capita birth rate. So how many births per individual, right? So if on average, mice have 20 kids per year, that would be B, 20. Okay. Whereas on average, if humans have 0.1 kid per year, which is actually way high, that means for every person for every year, they'd have 0.1 of a kid. So it would take them 10 years to have a kid, basically. So if you live to 20, you'd have 2. If you live to 30, you'd have 3. We know that's not right. M is mortality, so the per capita death rate, how many people die every year. So your chances of dying, basically. And N is population size. So if we have 25 births per year in a population of 100, so N equals 100, little b would equal to 25 divided by 100. 25 births in a year per 100 individuals, or a 0.25 birth rate. So the expected births in a year of a population of 1,000, well, we got a 0.25 birth rate and 1,000 individuals, so we'd expect, a quarter of them to have kids. We'd add to 250 kids. Okay. So there's our, number of kids we're adding minus the mortality rate times the population. So we expect, if we had a 0.25 mortality rate, it would be 0.25 times 1,000 in that last example. So you lose 250 to death, but we gain 250 to birth. So we'd have, 1 minus 1, we'd have 0. And that would be a steady population. 0 growth rate. Growing, but we're not shrinking either. A negative growth rate would be shrinking. So we can express that. Here's our original one, right? Births minus deaths. Here we got birth rate times the total population minus death rate times the total population. Same basic thing. That can tell us how many births there are per year. That'll tell me how many deaths we expect per year. So R, that per capita rate of increase, is birth rate minus death rate. So like I said before, if we had a birth per capita birth rate of 0.25 and a death rate of 0.25, our growth rate would be 0. R equals 0. Now, exponential growth is population increase under idealized conditions, like I said before. Under those conditions, the rate of increase is at its maximum, which we call R max. So maybe the max population growth for mice might be 40 per year per individual, as opposed to 20, which would be, other things are happening. So the equation for exponential growth is R max times n, not just R times n, which is the actual growth rate that's happening in nature. R max is under ideal conditions. This is how much we'd expect the population to grow every year. So this population growth results in a J-shaped curve. So if we had a 0, right, the curve would just be flat. If R was 0.5n, this is the curve. And if it was 1n, we'd get a much steeper curve. If we had 2n, it'd be even steeper. Okay. The rate of increase is constant here, but the population accumulates more individuals per unit time when it's larger than when it's small. So if let's just say we double a population every generation. So we go from 2 to 4 to 8 to 16 to 32. It's not huge, but then we keep going, 32 to 64 to 128 to 256 to 502. I don't know. Just keep on going. If you just keep doing that math, if you double it every year, doubling here isn't that much, right? But doubling here is here. Doubling here is all the way up here. Doubling here, we're way off the chart. We can see an example of that. Like I said, we see it with invasive species because they don't have as many limiting factors holding their population down. But we saw a pretty clear-cut example of that in Kruger National Park in South Africa. When they got rid of hunting in that park, we went from a population way down here, and we got rid of the limiting factor, the death rate. We reduced the mortality rate because they weren't being killed off before they could have kids. And so it started growing slowly, but then in the late 60s, it really took off as exponential growth happened. So now Kruger National Park either has to give birth control to the elephants, or they actually give the elephants away to other nations and other parks to help them grow their herds now, which is pretty cool. All right, so before we get back together, guys, if you can do concept check 53.2 in your book, page 1192, number 2 and 3, do that. We'll talk about those in class, but then I'll come back and we'll talk about the next section notes. All right, folks, welcome back. Let's start the section on logistic growth patterns, which are still just a model in an idealized world, like any kind of a model. It's not going to be perfectly mimicked out there in nature, but it is way closer to what actually happens in most situations. So logistic growth is when a population grows more slowly as it nears its carrying capacity. So, like I said before, exponential growth cannot be sustained for long in any population. You can keep growing and growing and growing, but eventually you're going to run out of resources, right? Not going to have enough space, not going to have enough food, not going to have enough water, things like that. So, a more realistic population model limits growth by incorporating something we call carrying capacity, or K, and that is the maximum population size the environment can support indefinitely. I do want to add in the term indefinitely there, because a environment might be able to support a larger population for a few months, but then it'll often crash after that if it gets like you overeat the food. So carrying capacity truly is the max population size the environment can support indefinitely, year after year. And carrying capacity varies with the abundance of limiting resources. Now, we learned about those in Bio 1. What are some examples of limiting resources? Yeah, resources that if you don't have them, limit the size of a population, right? Food, water, shelter, space, mates, disease, all those kind of things can be limiting factors. And limiting factors can affect either the birth rate, right? If you're starving, you're probably not going to be able to have kids, or they can affect the mortality rate and actually kill you as well. So in logistic growth model, the per capita rate of increase declines as carrying capacity is reached. So here's carrying capacity, all right, or K is this line right here. That's the approximate maximum number of individuals that this particular habitat environment can support over time. So we can see at the beginning it looks a lot like a logistic or a exponential model, but then the rate slows and it slows, and the closer it gets to the top, the closer the growth rate gets to 0. So the logistic model starts with the exponential model. If I cut off this red box here, this right here is the exponential model, right? Then we add in this expression where the per capita rate of increases n approaches k. Okay. So when n is small compared to k, so look back here. So we got here's our exponential growth rate, right? The maximum number of rate of growth for a particular population size. Okay, gives us our population in the next generation. So if we multiply that by k minus n, so the carrying capacity minus the actual population, and divide it by the carrying capacity, and multiply that number by this, we can figure out what the rate of growth is going to be in that model. So when n is small compared to k, when the population size is small compared to the carrying capacity, that term, k minus n over k, is close to 1, and the per capita rate of increase approaches the maximum. In a second, pause this, try to rephrase that without the variable letters. Come up with, do it with numbers, do it with examples, but rephrase it for yourself without the variables. Pause it now. Okay, so here's how I think about it. So let's say your carrying capacity is 1,000, but if your population is 10, 1,000 minus 10, that's 900. Okay, so 900 divided by 1,000 is 0.9, so it's really close to 1. So that's still a really steep curve, still a lot of growth, right? It's not quite, 1, it's not that. Or let's say you had a population of 1 and the capacity is 1,000. That'd be 999 divided by 1,000. It's going to be really high. And so if it's 1, if this is 1, it doesn't change this, right? This number can only be less than 1, so 0.9 is still going to slow this down. 0.5 is going to slow it down even further. 0.9 is going to really slow this down. 0.9 times something, right? Or I inverted my numbers. I'm sorry. The closer this is to 1, the bigger this is going to be, not the other way around. So 0.9 is going to slow it down a little bit. 0.1 is going to slow it down a lot. So when n is large compared to k, then the term k minus n divided by k is close to 0. And the per capita rate of increase is small. Pause it and rephrase that. Okay, so let's say we're dealing with our same carrying capacity of 1,000, and if n is large compared to k, if n is like 900 compared to k, so 1,000 minus 900, that's 100, divided by 1,000 is 0.1. So it's closer to 0. So 0.1 times whatever this is, that's going to be that's going to reduce it a lot, right? If it was 0, it would take the growth rate right down to 0. So that's why the closer you get to 0, the closer you get to a growth rate of 0. And when n equals k, no growth, right? If n equals k, that's 1,000 minus 1,000, which is 0, divided by 1,000 is 0. And so no growth. All right, so logistic growth model population produces this S-shaped curve, which levels out here around carrying capacity, and the growth rate gets shallower as you approach carrying capacity. New individuals are added to the population most rapidly, right in the middle. You can see that's where the curve is the steepest. All right, so how do we, how's the logistic model compared to real populations? So the growth of paramecium fits that S-shaped curve pretty tightly. Okay, they're grown in a constant environment, lacking predators and competition. It's just food, water, and space. Okay, and it seems to match pretty well. But these water fleas over here, okay, they don't. You see how they way overshoot? and then they crash below, and then they come back up again. Can you hypothesize about why that um, water flea, it's not a fruit fly, that water flea graph looks like this in terms of resources, reproduction, that sort of thing? Yeah, because right here they're approaching that curve, but she may have some energy reserves. She may use those energy reserves to give birth to kids. Puts her at a bit of a risk, but she can have more kids in the next generation. So then they way overshoot briefly, but now these guys up here don't have enough resources, and a lot of them, the mortality rate greatly increases, and the birth rate probably drops because they're all starving. So that when it drops way below carrying capacity. So we can get this crazy up and down stuff going for some populations. Um, the goal in like resource management, DNR type stuff, is to keep this pretty steady and not let it have big ups and downs. Some populations do show something called an allele effect. I won't keep on to say allele, but the allele effect, in which individuals have a more difficult time surviving or reproducing if the population size is too small. The example usually given for that is if you got a lone plant in the middle of a prairie, the wind can really damage it. But if it's surrounded by a bunch of other ones, they support each other, so less likely to get damaged. You can also think of this like finding a mate. If your population gets to a critically low level, they may have trouble finding a mate to be able to continue to increase their population. All right, if you can do these concepts for me, and I'll meet you on the other side, and we'll do the next section. All right, folks, let's move on to 53.4, evolution and life history diversity. So if we're talking about the life history of an organism, three main things or variables come into play. The age at which reproduction begins, so when you start having kids, how often do you have kids, and how many offspring do you have per reproductive episode. So you're something that doesn't have kids until you're 20 years old, and then you have 2 kids every 5 years until you're 50, or you're something that has 2,000 kids when you're 3 years old, and then nothing else, or where are you in that range? Okay. So species that exhibit something called similarity or Big Bang reproduction, they reproduce once and then die. Think salmon, right? They go out in the ocean, they swim around for like 4 years, and they swim back into the river where they were born, lay a couple thousand eggs, and then die. Okay. Species that exhibit heteroparity or repeated reproduction, so they reproduce on an iterative basis, they keep trying it over and over again, and produce offspring repeatedly, like us. Okay. Highly variable or unpredictable environments likely favor which of the above reproductive strategies and why? Think about that, pause it, we'll get back. Okay, the Big Bang, the similarity. Because in similarity, think like you're in a desert where you don't get rain a ton, and you're never sure when you're going to get rain. When you're going to release your spores, if you're a plant, release your spores to have reproduction happen, you want those spores to have the best chance of surviving, right? So you're going to just, all your life, you're just going to be building up, waiting for that one chance to reproduce. And then it happens, and you just throw it all out there, all your energy into that reproduction, okay? Because you don't know if you're ever going to get it again in your lifetime. So it's all or nothing for you. Whereas dependable environments will generally favor heteroparity. There are trade-offs depending on which life cycle you choose. Organisms do have finite resources, which lead to these trade-offs between survival on the one hand. You want to survive as an individual, but you also want to be able to reproduce to pass on those genes. Those are the kind of the two halves of the coin for natural selection, right? So, for example, there's a trade-off between survival and parental care. Can you give me some examples of how that might play out? There's all sorts of, we've talked about some before, like nesting birds, right? The longer you sit on that nest, the more energy you put into those chicks, the more likely those chicks are to survive. But the more likely it is that you will die because you're kind of literally a sitting duck waiting for a predator to come get you. So things like that. So salmon versus human, we've talked about that before, just a little bit ago. Plants, some plants can produce a large number of small seeds, okay, ensuring that at least some of them will grow and eventually reproduce. So not all of them will. If they're small little seeds, they don't have much stored energy. A lot of them aren't going to make it until they can grow. Other types of plants put a ton of energy in just a few large seeds. Think walnuts, right? Um, Big giant nuts, lots of stored energy in there. Now, it takes a lot of energy to produce those seeds. You don't produce as many of those seeds, but the seeds you do produce have a higher chance of success. So, which strategy gets you the most bang for your buck, the most genes continuing to the next generation? Kind of depends on the situation. And different organisms have evolved different strategies to do that. Some err on the side of putting lots of energy into few. Others err on the side of not a lot of energy, but have a lot of them. So here's some in-class questions. I'll read them. You think about them, pause it, and then we'll talk about them. So consider two rivers. One is spring-fed and has a constant water volume and temperature year-round. The other drains a desert landscape and floods and dries out at unpredictable intervals. Which river would you predict is more likely to support many species of Idioparis animals, and why? Pause it. The constant stream. Okay, it's going to have more stable conditions. More stable conditions lead to more stable populations. You're not going to have drastic fluctuations. Because you have more stable populations, there's going to be competition for resources. Larger, more cared for young from the Idioparis reproduction is going to have a better chance of survival. They're going to need a little help. Okay. Whereas if you were in the boom and bust stream, there's probably not a lot of competition, probably not a big population around, and you might only get one shot to reproduce. Okay. Number two, in the fish called the peacock wrasse, females disperse some of their eggs widely and lay other eggs in a nest and take care of them. Only the later ones in a nest, get that parental care. Explain the trade-offs in reproduction that this behavior illustrates. Pause it, and then we'll go back and talk. All right. It's basically the old adage, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right? Nested eggs are more likely to survive, but they cost the parent more energy and increase the risk of predation. But each uncared for egg is less likely to survive, but has a lower cost to the parent. So you kind of get the best of both worlds there. And lastly, what if? Mice that experience stress, such as a food shortage, will sometimes abandon their young. Shame on them. Explain how this behavior might have evolved in the context of reproductive trade-offs and life history. Think about it, pause it, and then we'll talk. It's kind of the old adage, live to fight again another day, right? If you greatly reduce the parent's chance of survival to keep one brood alive, it might be more evolutionarily advantageous, in other words, more genes passed on in the long run, for the parent to keep themselves alive and reproduce again later. Okay, so this only applies to species that reproduce with Idioparis reproduction, where they're having babies over and over again over their lifetime. Because if you've got a young mother, she's got a brood of, let's say, a dozen mice that she's nursing, but then drought and famine come along. Now, if she stays and tries to keep those dozen mice alive, she runs a very big risk of starving and dying herself, right? And then if she does that, she won't have any other kids ever. Okay. But if she abandons those ones, yes, those genes are not going to make it to the next generation. But she can have another dozen mice 3 months later, and another dozen after that, and another dozen after that, and another dozen after that. So the chances of more of her genes making it to the next generation increase. All right, folks, welcome back to the last part of Part 3 notes, where we're going to hit AP Bio topic 8.4, the effect of density on populations. You can find stuff on this in Chapter 53.5 in your book. So many factors that regulate population growth are density dependent. So there are two general questions about the regulation of population growth when we're looking at this. What environmental factors stop a population from growing indefinitely, growing forever? Can you give me some? Yeah, things like not enough food, space, water, finding mates, those kind of things. Um, why do some populations show radical fluctuations in size over time? Well, others remain stable. Yeah, it could be a whole bunch of different things, right? It could be fluctuations in the weather, it could be fluctuations in water availability, it could be fluctuations in the prey availability or the predator numbers. All sorts of things can affect that. And the studying that is really kind of tricky to try to parcel out which things are affecting and which things aren't. So we can have population change and population density often go hand in hand. So in density independent population factors, birth rate and death rate do not change with population density. It means you could have 500 people packed into a football field and they'd be just fine and their growth rate would be fine. Or, you could have two people in the field and their growth rate would be fine. It doesn't seem to matter how dense it is. Can you think of some examples of this where this might happen? Well, it could be things like, I don't know, a volcano exploding, right? It doesn't matter if your population is dense or really spread out and low. Um, if you're living on the side of a mountain and the mountain explodes, you're probably going to die, right? Or, a tsunami on the shore. You could have a dense population or a not dense population. Doesn't matter. That event is going to affect everybody pretty equally. On the other hand, how about a density dependent population factor, where birth rates fall and death rates rise with population density? Yeah, those are kind of more the classic things we tend to think about, right? Like if the population gets too dense for the area, there may not be enough space for everybody, or there may not be enough food for everybody, or there may not be enough water for everybody. So your growth rate is going to start declining and maybe even falling, going into the negative R in those kind of situations. So some factors come into play when the population gets too dense and starts affecting population size and growth rate. Some factors, and that's density dependent, some factors come into play regardless of how dense your population is. And those are generally more abiotic in nature, more climate weather related, and those are density independent population factors. So, density dependent birth and death rates are an example of a certain type of feedback that regulates population growth. What kind of feedback do you think it is, guys? So if your population gets too dense, you there's feedback that causes your population to come back down and not be too dense. What do you call that? Yeah, that's negative feedback, right? There's something that's working. If something's getting too high, something in nature is working to bring it back down. Or if something gets too low, something works to bring it back up. And there are many factors that can affect that in density dependent situations. And we'll mention each of them here briefly: competition for resources, territoriality, disease, predation, toxic waste, intrinsic factors to the psychology of the organism. Let's take a look at it. So, competition for resources. Think of a farmer's field. Uh, if you increase the population density of, say, wheat plants, that's got pictured here, it's going to be harder for um, you don't want to have it. You don't want to plant your wheat too dense, or there's not going to be enough food and water for all your wheat, and all your wheat plants are going to be kind of weak and not healthy. But you want to plant them as dense as you can, because those wheat plants will hopefully outcompete other weeds and things, so other weeds and stuff don't grow in and steal the water and the sunlight and the nutrients from the soil that you want to go into your wheat plants. So you get the right density of planting, and that's why there's always recommended spacings and things like that for most seeds when you're planting them, to make sure you get as dense as possible to reduce competition with other organisms, so interspecies competition, but you don't get intraspecies competition. Okay. Disease, I mean, guys tend to get sick more often in the wintertime when you're in school than when you're at home in the summer, in large part because during the school year, you're in a fairly dense environment. You're very close to lots of people all day long. Very easy for diseases to spread and pathogens to spread. Predator prey density. As prey density increases, predation will increase, And the more predation you got, the more it's going to try to bring down the prey. So here we can see we've got these kelp perch right here and the bass. Now the kelp perch live in the kelp, hence their name, and they hide out in there. Okay. As their population increases in size, though, at some point, there's not enough kelp for all of the school to hide in there effectively, which makes it much easier for the bass to catch those extra kelp. So when density increases, some of them can't hide, and that makes it more likely they're going to get eaten by the bass. So when the population is smaller, it's harder for the bass to catch them. As prey population builds up, predators may feed preferentially on that species. So if you've got a bunch of different things out there in the world that you can eat, but all of a sudden the lemming population right here gets really high, there's just lemmings everywhere. So you start feeding mostly on lemmings because you see them. They're easy to find, they're easy to catch compared to the other things. So in that situation, having a high dense population, you're probably going to get predated on more than if you were a less dense population. We've talked about territoriality before. So a way to limit density so you don't get too dense, so there's plenty of resources for everybody, is to mark your territory and say, this area is mine, this is enough for me and my family, you guys go somewhere else. Intrinsic factors or psychological factors tend to regulate population sizes and some things. Like we can see that in mice. These mice show a drop in reproduction at high densities. So if their population gets really dense, okay, we're going to see hormonal changes that will delay sexual maturation, so the mice won't become sexually mature as early, which will reduce the number of births they can have over their lifetime. And it can actually also depress the immune system, which causes them to die more. So they kind of self-regulate there a little bit if their population is getting fairly dense. Here's this one. I'm not going to talk about it, but the accumulation of toxic waste can contribute to density-dependent regulation of population size. So here we've got 3 pictures. We've got some yeast. We've got some wine that's 14% alcohol by volume here, and you can see the wine over here. So can you figure out why these pictures illustrate the concept of toxic waste and pollution affecting population density? Pause it and think. Okay, so if you know anything about winemaking, you take some yeast, you put them in with some essentially grape juice. The yeast eat the carbs, turn it into alcohol, right? And that's what's happening in the wine. Problem is, the alcohol created by the yeast is toxic to them. They're swimming around in their own waste, basically, in those bottles. Okay, just like if you were swimming around in peeing and pooping in your own water. Eventually, it would kill you, right? So that's what happens here at around 13% or so alcohol by volume. The yeast start to die, and that stops the process. So it keeps the yeast population low or even kills them all at some point. They wind up causing their own death. All right. The study of population dynamics focuses on the complex interactions between biotic and abiotic factors that cause variation in population size. So that's what we've been looking at, these population dynamics. You know, we've got the yeast, we've got the abiotic toxins they're producing, and how do these things interact to regulate how big or low the population is, or what rate it's growing or shrinking at. And we do see stability in some areas and fluctuation in others. Now, we used to think things were usually stable, but the more we study it, the more we see instability. So we've got like these long-term studies. We looked at this already in Ecology and Bio 1, guys, the moose and the wolves in Isle Royale. But basically, you got this nice little, essentially closed ecosystem in this island in the middle of Lake Superior, right? Moose got out there a long time ago. And then around in the early 1900s, some wolves got out there. And so the wolves mainly prey on the moose. The moose main thing that was killing them was the wolves. And then, of course, you got a limited supply of food for the moose there. So there's some constraints on this. We don't have much immigration affecting population. So the populations going up and down is purely a result of what's happening on that island. Okay, so it's a nice study environment. And you can see here when the moose population was high, a little bit later, the wolf population got really high, right? Because down here, they had plenty of moose to eat. They were fat and happy, had lots of birds, but then they overpopulated, and they started eating too many moose, and so the moose population crashed, which meant that, up here, these guys had hardly anything to eat because there weren't as many moose around. So they got really sick and died. Boom, and they crashed. And the moose started going up again, and so on and so forth. You can see this back and forth. We can see something similar with population cycles. A classic is the snowshoe hare and lynx in northern Canada and Alaska. There seems to be a 10-year cycle of boom and bust. Snowshoe hare population rises, then shortly after that, the lynx population rises, then snowshoe drops, and then lynx drops, and back and forth every 10 years, like clockwork almost. And there's been two main hypotheses that have been put forward to try to explain why this happens, why they don't just come to a more stable carrying capacity. Because, you're talking up here like 150, and down here, 15? That's massive change. So there's two hypotheses. The first hypothesis that was put out was the hare population cycle follows a cycle of winter food supply. So maybe there's something going on with, whatever it is they're eating, the buds on bushes and stuff, that every 10 years or so they don't produce as much or something like that. Question to you is, how can you test that? How can you test that the food supply was what was causing the cycle? If it's correct, then if we just supplied them with plenty of food, regardless, right, over time, we should be able to eliminate food as the variable. So if additional food was provided to a hare population and the whole population increased in size, so the population got bigger, but it still cycled. We still had the up and down. Population was bigger because there's more food, but it still went up and down on its 10-year cycle. So is that supported? Is that hypothesis supported? Not really. Another hypothesis was put forward was the hare's population cycle is driven by pressure from other predators. Okay, not just the lynx, for instance. How can you test this? Well, you have to find out what is actually killing the hares. Is it other predators, or is it other things? And when they actually studied that, collared them and stuff like that, found out most of them were killed by the predators, including lynx, coyotes, hawks, and owls. So that is supported, at least. It doesn't prove that that's what's going on, but does support that idea more. So the availability of prey is a major factor influencing predator population dynamics. If you got very few prey, then the predators might start eating each other, right? Because you could dog eat dog world, right? Coyotes will start eating the foxes and things like that, which they wouldn't normally if there's plenty of hares around. So they start eating them, and then that crashes the predator population, and then the predator population is really low, so then the hares can make a comeback. Hares make a comeback, then predators got plenty of food, so they can start reproducing more, and they go up, but then they overproduce, and we start the whole cycle over again. We'll finish up with this video here, guys, and then you can go to the next video, part 4, and we'll take a look. We'll catch back up with you there. See ya. Bye.
What factors affect the size of a population over time? Let's zoom in to St. Paul Island in Alaska, where reindeer were introduced in 1911. We can look at the size of the reindeer population over time using a graph. The horizontal axis shows time, and the vertical axis shows population size, the number of reindeer. The population increased when the birth rate was greater than the death rate. The population decreased when the death rate was greater than the birth rate. Now, let's look at the pattern of growth in this reindeer population. At first, the reindeer had plenty of food. The population grew slowly, and then grew faster and faster as the population got bigger. This pattern is exponential growth. which occurs when a population has unlimited resources. Of course, resources are never truly unlimited. As the reindeer population exploded, food ran out, and the population crashed. Exponential growth cannot continue forever. St. Paul Island is also home to fur seals. When seal hunting was reduced, the population grew in a way that initially resembled exponential growth. But as growth continued, some individuals could not find suitable breeding space, and the birth rate declined. Eventually, the birth rate equaled the death rate, and the population reached carrying capacity, the maximum population size the habitat can support. This pattern is logistic growth. In Lake Superior, Ile Royale is home to moose, whose population size is shown in red, and wolves, whose population size is shown in blue. As wolves preyed on moose, the moose population crashed and wolf numbers increased. But with fewer prey, the wolf population also crashed. This allowed the moose population to rebound. This pattern of interrelated ups and downs is sometimes seen in predator-prey situations. Some factors that limit population size depend on the density of the population, how many individuals occupy a certain amount of space. Density-dependent factors include limited food, limited breeding space, and predators. Density-independent factors do not depend on population density. For example, an oil spill affects all the birds in the area, regardless of their density. Population ecology helps us understand human population growth and where we might be headed next.